history of religion. But I really love teaching about South Africa because it gives us a chance to understand the making of processes of global inequality. It gives us the chance to understand how another deeply racist society has attempted to reconcile from its difficult past. And it has a history that is at once kind of like the United States, but also different in key ways. And I find these really great things to think about and to use this sort of as a mirror into US society as well. But I realized, so generationally, I grew up with South Africa on television all the time. I grew up, seeing Mandela become president of South Africa. South Africa was in the news a lot. For my students, not so much anymore. And so, it looks like sort of multi-generational crowd here for you all. When you think of South Africa, what do you think of? If you just put some words in the chat, I would really appreciate it. Cricket, I love it. Awesome. Apartheid, yes. Decline of the ANC, EFF, DA, and polarization, Bo and Kelly, wow. How do you know so much about South Africa? Okay, you also don't have to answer, don't worry, sorry, didn't mean to cold call you. but that's a lot. I expected like apartheid, right? Just moved back from 5 years in South Africa. Okay, got it. That's how. I thought maybe that was a different entry. Got it. Okay, that's how you know so much about it. So political groups, the ANC, the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela's party, and other political groups sense in Bowen's answer. Steve Biko, thank you, Stacy. Biko is going to come up tonight. And Trish Anderson, you grew up there. Wow, so we have 2 South African connections. Excellent. So hold me accountable with my history. It's been very interesting. I get a lot of students whose parents are South African, but the students grew up in the United States and consider themselves US citizens. And they go home and talk to their parents about the account of South African history they get in my class. And there are often some discrepancies. So maybe that will come up in what we hear from these people with South African connections in the group tonight. But great, thank you. So today I am going to talk about how the apartheid government in South Africa enacted a new system of education, and how that system of education under apartheid became sort of a cause for protest, but also a site of organizing against the apartheid government, how schools themselves became sites of pushing back against apartheid, and how they helped bring about the end of apartheid as well. And so to do this, I'm going to talk at first about apartheid itself, what it was, how to define it, and sort of where education policies fit into broader apartheid projects. Then I'm going to transfer to talking about schools as sites of protest, and the ideas and issues that really galvanize students to get them to push back against this oppressive form of governance. And when I do that, we'll think a little bit too about what it was like to be a student in schools at the time that they were sites of protest as well. And then I'll wrap up by thinking about some of the legacies of student struggles in South Africa today. And so before we get started, I just want to say too, that South Africa is a place that's known for its extreme racism, and that racism was enforced through violence. So I want to let you know that we will be talking about police violence tonight, and police violence against protesters in particular. I also want to encourage you to stop me, to ask questions, to use the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on it, but Stacy, if I miss something, if you don't mind flagging it, that'd be great. But also, stick your hand up. Feel free to ask questions at any point. Okay, so where I wanted to start was actually with a piece of legislation from 1953. I'm going to drop this legislation in the chat so that you can all open it on your computers at home. We are not going to read the whole thing, really only the first line, and then some sections that I have marked with green arrows. But first I want to make sure that everybody can get into it and open it. Everybody in? No. Okay. Moving very slowly. Yes, okay, Mary got it. Other people? Okay, let me try to put it in the chat again, okay? It's just a PDF, so with any PDF. Got it, okay. Others? Still no, Abra, okay. No, Lisa, yes, Trish. Okay, I have a backup plan, which is that, well, here, I'll do screen share is what I'll do. So you can see my version of the document if you can't open it yourself, okay? Oh, and I see some people are saying it's just taking a little bit of time to download, but I will go ahead and do screen share. Okay, so this piece of legislation, I already mentioned, passed in 1953. Its official name has a derogatory term that we don't really use anymore. So its official name was the Bantu Education Act. That's how you will see it referred to in South African, or not, well, history texts in general. But I'm just going to refer to it as the Apartheid Education Act from here on out, okay? So I think it'll be pretty clear from how we talk about this, or what you see in the text of it, that this was a power grab on the apartheid government. But what I'd like you to think through as we kind of go through this document and some of the sections that I've highlighted is from whom the apartheid government is trying to grab power, okay? So this first line, this is an act to provide for the transfer of the administration and control of Native education from the several provincial administrations to the government of the Union for matters incidental hereto. So the Union is the Union of South Africa. That's what that Union is in reference to. So then my first green arrow down at the bottom of this first page, there shall cease to be vested in the executive committee of a province any powers, authorities, and functions, and the provincial council of a province shall cease to be competent to make ordinances in relation to Native education. Okay, so think about from whom they're trying to take power. A little bit further down, my next green arrow, so the minister, this is the Minister of Education under the apartheid government, may in his discretion at any time suspend, reduce, or withdraw any subsidy or assistance granted to any such school under this section. So any of these schools, the Minister of Education can determine, how much money they get and if they get money at all. This next green arrow, so the Minister, again, of Education may at any time, whenever he considers it expedient to do so, close or disestablish any such government school, hostel, teachers' quarters, school clinic, or other accessory to a government school. And I think I only have like 2 more arrows. This next one, so the teaching establishment at any government school shall be determined by the minister on a basis to be laid down from time to time in consultation with the Minister of Finance and on the recommendation of the Public Services Commission. I thought this was interesting because there's some qualifying language in here. Not only is the Minister of Education taking power, but saying the government wants to be in control of everything unless, some schools have given their teachers pensions, and then those schools are still responsible for paying those pensions, not the government. So there's one way that they're not wanting to take power. And then I think I have one more arrow, that the minister shall have control relating to the admission of pupils or students to, and control and treatment of pupils or students at, and the discharge of pupils or students from any government school, okay? So I'm gonna stop share, and then I just want us to think about this as a power grab for a minute. So from whom is the apartheid government trying to take power based on this legislation that they've outlined? Maybe, I don't know, in your schools, local schools and administrations, absolutely, right? I mean, does the Secretary of Education decide which pupils get to go to your schools? And how much funding that your schools get? Right? No. So this is all being concentrated in the hands of the provincial government, or not the provincial government, the apartheid government. Decisions about who can attend, how much money, which teachers can work there. The apartheid government is taking control of all of this. And it's interesting because in the language of the act itself, taking control from taxpayers as well, that is absolutely right. And Africans in South Africa are paying a whole lot of the taxes, right? They are also stripping power from the provinces. So like the equivalent of our states. They're saying that provinces, state boards of education will have no control over this either. But what is actually in some ways most interesting to me is what they're not saying in this legislation. Because the other power that the apartheid government is taking control from through this legislation, the people who have provided most of the education for Africans in South Africa to this point are in fact not municipalities, not local governments, not provinces, but missionaries. Okay, so they're stripping power from missionaries. And I'm going to start my screen share of my PowerPoint. I have a lot of pictures that I want to show, but I was complaining to Stacy that I hate it that I can't see y'all very well when I've got screen share up. But still, if you want to stop me or raise your hand or whatever, please do it. It might just take me a minute to see you. So I'm going to screen share and show you some pictures. Sorry, one second. Here we go. Okay, so sorry, this is a little blurry on my big screen, but this is actually a picture of a missionary school in the early 20th century in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, okay? Education was central to missionary endeavors in South Africa from the 19th century on. As you can imagine, missionaries had a hard time at first conveying some of the ideas of Christianity to people who hadn't heard much about them before. Some of those ideas were hard to translate. But one thing that Africans always wanted from missionaries was education and was literacy. So education was kind of the thing that missionaries did in South Africa when they weren't having much success at winning souls. They taught people how to read instead. And they did win some souls along the way. And so these schools that missionaries started eventually kind of generated a new kind of educated class of people in South Africa, a class of people who wore clothes made of cotton, who lived in square homes, who organized their families and and conventions with sort of Christianity, who had men who worked outside the home and women who worked inside. Schools and the missionary endeavor were sort of sites of trying to transform Africans' existence. And from this emerges this kind of African elite in South Africa. And a key part of why the apartheid government is trying to wrest control of education from missionaries is that the apartheid government is waging war on this African elite. So I have a picture, this is jumping in time to the 1940s. But this is a picture, anybody see any youthful faces of people you might know from later in South Africa's history in this picture? Mandela, yes, where's Trish, you got it, where's Mandela? Oh yeah, Boa too, Mandela's on the left, right? A young Mandela is on the far left of this picture, okay? The man in who's getting married, Walter Sisulu, is one of his best friends. The man to the right of the groom is also a good, well, I mean, they're all good friends. They're at a wedding together and they're all dressed up. But almost all of the people in this picture had been educated at mission schools, okay? So Nelson Mandela, born in 1918, right? So in the context of World War I, born in the rural Eastern Cape, not far from that earlier picture that I showed you of this mission school, goes to the best missionary schools in his area and gets even to a tertiary education. He gets to go to university offered by missionaries in South Africa. And so in this crew of people, I mean, you can see, I mean, what strikes you? I don't know. I love this picture. I love this picture so much. But what strikes you, about this image? What stands out to you about this picture from 1945? Put it in the chat or say it, either way. I mean, maybe this is like, is this what we expect weddings to look like in 1945 in South Africa? Assimilation, although it's interesting. So Bowen, that's so interesting, because assimilation is the word that people often associate with, images like this one of pictures of African wedding parties at this kind of white wedding, the fancy clothes, the suits, they're modern, they're fashionable, their attire, right? But what's so interesting is that like these are the people that the South African government has pegged as like enemy number one. Okay, this cohort of this educated African elite are the people that the apartheid government, through this Education Act, are trying to ensure sort of that their existence isn't possible anymore. The apartheid government wants to generate a new kind of class of Africans in South Africa and not get these ones who wear so-called Western clothes, even though these people consider these clothes to be very much their own, and who have been at the forefront of pushing back against unfair, unequal, and racist policies in South Africa, okay? So really, this is a war on missionary education. It is also a war on kind of the products of missionary education, people like Mandela, people of his generation. And I should say too, I mean, another thing that I think is important about understanding a picture like this one, like they all look so beautiful, but this elite that I'm talking about, because South Africa was such a racist society, it was always economically very tenuous. So these people were relatively well educated or formally educated compared to others in their communities. They had a lot of book learning. But Mandela will talk about, before this picture, he wore the same suit to work every day for 3 years. And by the end, it had so many patches that it was more patch than suit. He still had a very fragile economic existence, even as he was taking part of this this kind of community of people who were pushing back against the apartheid government, okay? So this is where the power grab really lies. This is what the apartheid government is trying to prevent in the future as part of its own projects and policies. And so this begs a question, sort of what I want to talk now about kind of the apartheid moment, how it came into being, sort of the origins of apartheid, to understand why education was so central to their project. And this is something that often surprises my students. It might not surprise you all, but do any of you know when kind of the apartheid government came into existence? Like when we mark the beginning of apartheid in South Africa? Marie, absolutely right, 1948. And that surprises a lot of my students because it seems so late. And there's a history of violence, of dispossession, of racism in South Africa long before 1948, obviously. But 1948 is the date when a white minority government led by a group of Afrikaner nationalists, I'm going to type this into the chat, who speak primarily this language called Afrikaans and consider themselves the descendants of Dutch settlers in South Africa. And I'm saying consider themselves because there's a lot of mixed race heritage among them, but anyway, they consider themselves white and that they are the inheritors of this Dutch tradition in South Africa. They take over the government in 1948. And that date is quite significant because 1948 is a time when there are signs in the rest of the world that things are starting to change, okay? So the 1948 is sort of seen as South Africa's U-turn. So for example, there's the founding of the United Nations and the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is, a statement that is very much pro-democracy and against colonialism and against minority rule. There's also the independence of India immediately after World War II, suggesting that colonialism isn't going to last forever and that these big empires are going to fall. And then in our own country too, I mean, 1948 is often the kind of the beginning of the long civil rights movement. It is the year that Harry Truman, by executive order, desegregates the armed forces, right? So we have signs of change that's too slow and not sufficient, but signs that things are going a different direction. And then this is also really key for thinking in contrast with South Africa. So not in 1948, but in 1954, we'll also have the Brown versus Board of Education decision, right? Which says that, separate but equal is not possible. South Africa is going to go on a U-turn in 1948. So what does this look like? I'm going to talk about, some policies just really quickly to give you an overview of kind of the whole package of things that come with early apartheid. So Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act makes it illegal for people of different racial categorizations to marry. And really all it does is sort of strengthen some laws that were in fact already on the books in South Africa. And it's a moment, again, in contrast with the US, where we're starting to see some of the laws like that taken off the books. South Africa is committing itself to these laws even more firmly. 1950, the Immorality Act says not even just that, marriages with people of different races are going to be illegal, but in fact, sex between people of different races is going to be illegal in South Africa. And this is a super awkward thing to police. And yet the South African government will try to police it. They will literally try to catch people of different races having sex in order to enforce the Immorality Act in 1950. A Population Registration Act is this piece of legislation that says that there will be 4 racial categories in South Africa. Actually, that's a little bit of a lie. First, it just says that there will be 3 racial categories in South Africa and that everybody has to be in one of them. So the first 3 categories that it identifies are white, African, and colored. And colored has a different history in South Africa than here, and it is a word that is still used in common parlance. So white, African, does anybody know what that sort of colored term means in South Africa, or have heard of it before? So it's people of kind of mixed racial heritage, although, I mean, there's a lot of interracial sex, even in the white and African categories in this heritage in South Africa. But colored is people, so when the Dutch first settled in South Africa, there were lots of Dutch men and there weren't a lot of Dutch women. And a lot of those Dutch men entered into relationships with African women that they encountered. And it was often their descendants that were classified as colored. Okay, so those are the first 3 categories. The last one that will come into sort of apartheid logic is Indian. Okay, South Africa has one of the largest Indian populations outside of India because of historic British Empire connections. It's interesting, at first in 1948, the apartheid government just wants all Indians to go back to India. And that's why it's not one of those 4 racial categories initially. They will realize that that's not possible and make Indian the 4th category a little bit later. So we get this Population Registration Act that says you have to be in one of these categories. The tests to determine, especially between that sort of colored and white category, are super arbitrary. I mean, race as a biological construct is always arbitrary, not as a social construct, but as a biological construct, we know this. In South Africa, there's no interest in something like there would be in the US South, like a so-called 1-drop rule, where if you have 1 drop of African blood, that makes you Black. In South Africa, to determine kind of where you fit in these categories, they'll do things like brown paper bag tests, stick a brown paper bag next to somebody's face. If you're lighter, you're white. If you're darker, you get classified as colored. Or hair texture tests, right? These things that are just ridiculous, but they keep up this fiction of race. And the reason that colored category in particular is so hard is because lots of colored people, because of this history of interaction with the Dutch, they speak Afrikaans too. They are Christians. They go to the same churches as the white people do, albeit in segregated congregations. So you can't just tell from like home language and things like that, sort of what category someone would be. So the Population Registration Act puts you in one of these categories. And then also you have to carry around an identity document that says what your category is. So it's apparent to people, to a police officer you might encounter or a government official, which category you fall in from your identity documents. And increasingly, your racial categorization determines your possibilities in life. And so we see this for the Group Areas Act. This determines that in urban areas in South Africa, there will be areas for people of different races. And if you happen to be living, if you're an African and you happen to be living in an area that is now designated a white area, you have to leave and you may be forcibly removed. The Group Areas Act initiates a wave of hundreds of thousands of forcible removals in South Africa that strip people of their homes and send them somewhere else based on their racial identification. Then this Reservation of Separate Amenities Act in 1953 is the biggest contrast to like a Brown v. Board decision, because what this decides, it doesn't even try to have the fiction of kind of separate but equal. The Reservation of Separate Amenities Act says that public works, government services should be separate, and it is fine if they are unequal. Okay, so no fiction of separate but equal. And then we also get the passage of the Apartheid Education Act in 1953 as part of this early wave of the apartheid government taking over. And so this leads us, this leads us to this, looking at this legislation is one way that people have tried to define, in fact, what apartheid was. And it's actually a really hard term to define, because it's clear that even though we can look back on it and see that there were common features, the people implementing this policy actually didn't really have a grand plan. I mean, they had some ideas that they wanted to implement, but they were improvising, they were figuring it out as they went, okay? And so looking back at legislation like that, historians today have come to a definition of apartheid that hinges upon these four things, okay? So first, that South Africa would be divided into 4 race groups, that African category would be further divided into 10 kind of ethnic groups. So words like Zulu or Sotho or Xhosa or Swana, that the apartheid government would kind of encourage an ethnic identity for communities of Africans. And what do you think is going on there? Why would the apartheid government want to encourage the African community to be further divided into 10 different ethnic groups? Divide and conquer. Yes, that's right. I mean, some of it is that also, I mean, these Afrikaner nationalists truly believe that strong nationalism kind of leads a people to their best destiny. That is what they have seen for their own history. And so some of it is just how they sort of understand the world working. But that African category is by far the largest in South Africa. And by encouraging these kind of ethnic divisions within that category, sort of one way of trying to bolster white minority rule, okay? So we got Africans further divided into 10 different ethnic groups. The third premise in defining apartheid is that whites should have absolute control over the state. The fourth, related to this, white interests should prevail over those of other race groups. And that is in fact okay. There should be no fictions of otherwise, that in apartheid South Africa, white interests will prevail. I think this definition works pretty well and encompasses a lot. The only thing that I would add to it too is that all of this is going to be backed up by a police state. And what we see is an increasingly aggressive response from the police in order to enforce these policies. Now, it may be no surprise. Oh, sorry, what was I gonna say? So returning to the issue of education in particular and where this fits. So I've already said that, the apartheid government is trying to wrest control from missionaries, but they're also trying to socialize a new kind of subject, okay? So they're trying to use education policy to enforce these ideals and use education policy as sort of a site of social control, to teach people this stuff and how to sort of organize themselves in society in this way. And so this leads us to one of the interesting contradictions of the apartheid takeover of education. Because on the one hand, and we can kind of see this from these numbers, so 1953 being the first year of the act, on the one hand, the apartheid government's takeover will lead to a dramatic expansion of access to education for African students in South Africa. Okay, so more students will be able to go to school than in the days of missionaries taking control of school. And we see a pretty significant increase in the 25 years from 1953 to 1988. But on the other hand, this is education for social control and for subservience. So this is the architect of this policy, the Minister of Education, that is referred to in the language of the Act, saying there is no place for the African in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching the African child mathematics when it cannot use it in practice? Okay, so this is racism that is at once really overt, but then also a little subtle. So it's overt because of his assumptions about what Africans should or should not learn. But it's a little subtle because is he saying that Africans aren't able to learn mathematics necessarily, or is he saying something else? I think he's saying that what apartheid, they shouldn't be learning. That's exactly right, right? He's saying that in apartheid South Africa, remember that educated African elite that they are trying to make sure doesn't continue to exist. They're saying if you are going to be an African and you are living in an apartheid South Africa, you need to understand your place in society. And these schools will educate you for that. So it's not that Africans cannot learn mathematics. It is that in apartheid South Africa, they have no reason to learn it. Okay, this is education to teach Africans, some have said, to be, drawers of water and hewers of wood. And then it also, fundamentally bakes in inequality into the structure of education. Okay, so unequal access. So at the same time that they're expanding education, they're also codifying the fact, remember, separate and unequal is okay. So in white schools under apartheid, the average student or teacher to student ratio would be 1 teacher to 18 students. In Indian schools, 1 to 27, in colored schools, 1 to 27 about as well. And then in African schools, 1 teacher for every 39 pupils. And then you also get conditions where, because the apartheid government isn't paying for facilities, students of different age groups, different levels, sort of crammed into the one-room schoolhouse. This is the kind of education that the apartheid government is willing to provide, even as it dramatically expands access to education. Yes, the learning experience. Thank you, Carolina. The learning experience absolutely involved violence on many levels. This is part of the point. Okay, so this is also an issue. I mean, this slate of new policies is not something that people in South Africa take lightly. So it is no coincidence that as the government of South Africa is, passing all these new laws, resistance to them escalates. People are in the streets protesting. The 1950s are when Nelson Mandela's party, the African National Congress, really becomes a mass movement. You have new forms of multiracial protest and interaction trying to push back against this. But this issue of education is actually a really hard one for the liberation movements. On the one hand, they don't know if they should boycott the schools. They worry about what will happen to parents, like these kind of debates we're having about COVID now, what's going to happen if kids don't go to school, are all playing out in South Africa. And so it's hard for the African National Congress, other protest groups to figure out how to respond to the education policy in particular. We can see from signs like the one on the far right that this is something that they are absolutely pushing back against, right? That this is education for slavery. And in response to this protest, the police start cracking down on protesters. So by the early 1960s, Nelson Mandela will be arrested for treason. A whole group of other leaders will be arrested as well. Those who aren't arrested will go into exile. The 1960s really represents a moment where kind of formal protest politics dwindle, the kind of doldrums of formal protest politics in South Africa as these movements fall apart in response to an authoritarian state. But what's interesting is about where a new form of protest politics starts to emerge. Okay, so by the late 1960s, after this kind of period of doldrums, you get the emergence of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. And it starts in schools. But interestingly, it doesn't start in primary or secondary schools. It starts at universities. So the person most associated with this movement, Black consciousness, is the person Stacy mentioned in the chat, Steve Biko. Okay, and Steve Biko, we can't explain everything about somebody based on their kind of generation alone. But it is really significant that Biko was born in 1946. So you remember apartheid starts in 48. He grows up in a world where he knows nothing other than apartheid, really. And yet he has this interesting experience where he is still one of the few students who is able to go to missionary schools, at least through his secondary education. And that's because this is really interesting. Anybody want to take a stab at the denominations? So what the apartheid government essentially says to missionary schools is that if you want to continue getting funding from the government, you have to let us take over your school. And so this means, missionaries have relied on government stipends. A lot of them just can't do it, so their schools fold. But there are like two denominations that push back and figure out how to fund their own schools without the government. Anybody want to take a stab? Anglicans is a great guess, but it's not the Anglicans. But think high church like the Anglicans. Catholics, it's the Catholics, that's exactly right. So the Catholics do this international fundraising campaign to keep Catholic schools open in South Africa. They do have a lot of money. Seventh-day Adventists, interestingly, are the others. And I don't know that I associate them with as much money, but it's the Catholics and the Seventh-day Adventists that figure out ways to keep their schools open. And so Steve Biko goes to Catholic schools. He goes to a Catholic primary school. He goes to a Catholic secondary school. So these are schools where he's not being taught for subservience, where he, there's still racism and problems, but he is getting a different kind of education. And it's not until he shows up at a university, the University of Natal, to study to be a medical doctor, that he kind of encounters apartheid education policies, but at the tertiary level. And this is really interesting because by and large, remember, the architect of this policy has said, African children don't need mathematics, but there's still little pockets of places where Africans and Indians and people of other races can pursue education even in government schools. And so there is one doctor training program for Indian, African, and colored students that happens to be at the University of Natal. And Steve Biko is in the program. So he's in the back row there, and he is third from the left in the picture. And even though this picture kind of shows him only with other students of color, it's actually while he's at the University of Natal that he starts dealing in kind of university and student politics. And he starts encountering white university students, white liberal university students, and thinking about the role that white students should have in the struggle, and the role that Africans and Indians and colored students should have in the struggle as well. So it's sort of student politics where he cuts his teeth on some of his ideas. So he launches this South African student organization that's an alternative organization to the kind of white-led student political groups. I think there are a lot of things that stand out about this picture or this image of their first newsletter, maybe not their first, but an early newsletter. But anything stand out to you about it? The fist, absolutely, right? And thinking of this, like really the late 1960s as this moment where, we see Black Power, we see like Aboriginal rights movements, we see, radical student protests in Europe and the United States. There's really something going on in the world. in the late 1960s. It is, well, it's also this, so it is a zine, but it's also just like a newsletter. Somebody's got to do like a great history of these like little, you know, mimeographed newsletters that people used to create back in the day. So we got the fist. Anybody notice anything about the seeming, you know, gender of all these people?
Male?
They're all men, right? This is one thing, as you know, as liberatory as Black consciousness is in many ways, there's a lot that's tough about how they think about gender and who's leading this movement, okay? So, you know, no movement is perfect, right? And some of it is about who gets to show up at schools, although if we go back to this picture, there is one woman in the group, right? But she doesn't end up on the cover of Sasso. But anyway, this is their alternative to the kind of white-led student political bodies. And it's through these student organizations that Biko and others start espousing ideas like this one. Okay, so the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Okay, have y'all seen that quote before or heard that quote before? Sort of saying that, you know, we have our minds, right? And this is why this Black consciousness, right? Our consciousness is what we can control. People can try to teach us other things, but if we have our minds right, that doesn't matter, okay? So this idea gets kind of packaged into Black consciousness, which on the one hand, is kind of ending psychological oppression, saying, yes, it's true, we might not be able to bring about political liberation tomorrow, but we can bring about liberation of our minds right now, okay? We cannot act in subservient ways to white people. We cannot buy into the idea that white people are somehow superior to us. So this sort of getting our minds right is a key part of Black consciousness. Another key part is redefining Blackness. Okay, so taking apartheid logic about divisions and saying, no, if you are not white in South Africa, you are Black. So using Black as a category that encompasses Africans, Indians, and coloreds too, and saying that that is also one way of kind of getting our minds right and breaking free of that apartheid logic. And then finally, a last component of this is about self-help. And this relates to these other two things as well, but like we can do things for ourselves. So Black consciousness manifests as like people opening their own medical clinics in rural areas, right? African doctors opening their own medical clinics and saying, we don't need help from the apartheid government to take care of ourselves. Opening their own daycare facilities, opening their own food banks. There's a much longer history in sort of transnational Black thought of this idea of self-help going back to Garvey and even before, but Black consciousness picks up on this and employs it in South Africa. And I've got to go fast because I've been talking a lot. So I'm going to try to speed up. But okay, so this idea of Black consciousness, it starts in the universities, but it moves into apartheid secondary and even in some cases primary schools. Okay, we see younger and younger students discussing, debating, sharing, and figuring out how to act upon these ideas. And one sort of key moment of this is the Soweto Uprising in 1976. Okay, so at Soweto, the issue is really that the apartheid government, which has had the power to choose the medium of instruction all along, has said now that subjects in secondary schools, so like high school level, like biology and math, will now be taught in Afrikaans. They have been taught in English, they will now be taught in Afrikaans. So there are a lot of problems with this. It's considered the language of the oppressor. These students are saying, why on earth do we learn biology in Afrikaans? What do we do with biology in Afrikaans or mathematics in Afrikaans? This doesn't help us in any way. And then it also means that teachers who might not be trained to teach in Afrikaans might lose their jobs. Okay, so this issue of the language policy becomes an important one. And so June 16th, 1976, students in Soweto, which is a township outside of South Africa, lead a march. And you can see some of the pictures of the students who are marching through Soweto. You can see, maybe you can see on the sign in the background that says, don't shoot, we are not fighting. Students have their hands up, right? It's a symbol with enduring and global resonance around the world. This next picture shows more students who are protesting. This is interesting. So this sign that these students are holding is kind of a word merger of a racial epithet, kind of South Africa's equivalent of the N-word, and then Afrikaans, saying, using that racial epithet and Afrikaans, that kind of word blend away with, to say that this would be treating us or teaching us to be subservient even more, right? And then also we see here another group of students protesting. Sorry, it's a little bit blurry. I was just trying to give you a sense of the scale of this. But thousands of students show up to protest in Soweto. They are protesting peacefully. The South African government opens fire on some of them and ends up killing anywhere from 200 to 700 people over the next 2 days, okay? And this leads more broadly to a traumatic crackdown in the township. So not only are people injured and die in those first 2 days, but the police are trying to track down everybody involved. Students are picked up, taken into detention, tortured. Others go into exile to try to escape. There are these huge kind of ripple effects of this movement. But what's so interesting is that something sort of similar had happened in the 1960s as well, when protests died down. And we'll see that the South African government will use many of the same tactics, although in some cases even more brutal. I mean, it's no coincidence that so Steve Biko will be killed in police detention. So this person who's so associated with Black consciousness will be killed in police detention in 1977. So 1 year after this, as part of this crackdown. So they're killing political leaders. They're banning students groups, saying it's illegal to be part of student groups, torturing people, arresting, using these tactics of intimidation. But because these schools have so many students and because they have become such powerful sites for protest, it's impossible. It doesn't work this time. So, the crackdown that had worked in the 1960s doesn't work in the 1980s. It's right, power in numbers, and they just can't stop the protests. They can't get the protest to stop. And so what this leads to by the 1980s is this era when students are still protesting, right? So we see quite young children here who are at a protest. It's interesting, something I noticed in looking at these pictures, there are lots of pictures from this era of kids carrying little coffins, not only to say like bury apartheid, but also to say, look at who you're killing children, right? So we see kids leading protests. We see new issues emerge. This is another example. There's no one in that coffin. It is a coffin being carried symbolically to make this point about the apartheid government carrying children. But new issues emerge as the police try to crack down. And we see the police take over South African schools, okay? And so this is a case where, so this is a member of actually the South African Defense Forces who is guarding a school for Africans at a school outside in Johannesburg. Botha is the name of the Prime Minister of South Africa at this time, and somebody has spray painted his name with a Nazi symbol on the side of the school, right? So this is an era when students are protesting, they're boycotting, they are in the streets, they are actively contributing to an effort to make South Africa ungovernable to try to end apartheid. And just as Marie said, this is power in numbers. This is a remarkable chapter of sort of protest history. But one thing I really want to emphasize too is that it comes with some really heavy costs for the students themselves. And so this is also an era when things like, if you should go to school at all, if you should wear your uniform to school, if you should take exams that will help you go on to, advance your career and your education, all of these things are highly, highly politicized. And judgments are being made about your choices. And there's this really terrific South African scholar, South African historian named Jacob Dlamini, who was in high school at this time, who was in high school in South Africa in the 80s. And he made the choice to wear his uniform, to go to school, and to take the tests. And he writes, despite its fixation on racial purity, apartheid generated an unwanted intimacy between people that built in insidious complicity into daily life, right? That him just trying to succeed, just trying to do his thing, just trying to do well in school, made it seem like he was having to make all these choices about if he was, supporting the government or not, even though his politics were very much against apartheid. And so this does a lot of damage to a lot of communities. And it also, makes it really hard for the post-apartheid government to start, re-inculcating the value of going to school, right? And to get people to want to go to school again. And so I will just say that, on the one hand, these movements are very successful. The fact that protest doesn't let up will mean that by the time the Cold War ends in 1989, South Africa is sort of ready for change that will lead Mandela into office. But there are still all these hard repercussions from this era. So I just want to pause real quick, and I might go back into my screen share. I can either answer some questions now, or I can talk about some of the legacies of this in post-apartheid South Africa. So I just wonder what you all would prefer. And if you don't have questions, I'll talk about post-apartheid South Africa. Post-apartheid South Africa? Okay, we'll wrap up with that. Excellent. Okay, back to screen share. Okay. So, post-apartheid. So in response to the importance of education and to what has happened with education, the post-apartheid government writes in its Bill of Rights access to education as something that every South African deserves. Okay, so this is from the South African Constitution, from its Bill of Rights. So the Constitution is drafted in 1996, after Mandela comes into power in 1994. So everyone has the right to an education, to a basic education, and extending this to adult education as well. So people who might have lost their ability to go to school because of apartheid era politics should get the opportunity to recoup some of that in post-apartheid South Africa. And this is interesting too, that everyone has the right to further education, which the state, through reasonable measures, must make progressively available and accessible. So this is acknowledging that the South African government can't do everything for everybody right away, but it is the job of the South African government to make education progressively available to its citizens. And this is really interesting because South Africa's constitutional court, so it's kind of its equivalent of its Supreme Court, has made a lot of decisions about what that kind of progressively available means. It has been a subject of a lot of debate in South Africa. This next one is interesting too. Everyone has the right to receive education in the official language or languages of their choice in public educational institutions where that education is reasonably practicable. Okay, so we see the legacy of those kind of language politics of the apartheid era in the legislation that gets drafted by the post-apartheid government. But also that the government will have to factor in equity, practicability, and the need to address the results of past racially discriminatory laws and practices. So they're going to weigh all these things as they think about the language of instruction and what citizens in South Africa are owed. And this is, South Africa has had, unfortunately, a hard time realizing a lot of these ideals. The late 1990s was a difficult time to becoming a newly independent country. There was an economic downturn. The South African government faced this enormous HIV/AIDS crisis that they hadn't been expecting, and it was now all of a sudden their burden that they had to deal with. And so what we've seen happen in South Africa, especially at the primary and secondary level, is that really private schools and low-fee private schools have been moving in to fill some of the void of public education in South Africa. So we've seen sort of a fundamental reworking of the terrain. But interestingly, universities have stayed public. Remember, universities were the site of this initial Black consciousness movement, and universities in post-apartheid South Africa have been some of the sites of some of the most important protests in the post-apartheid era as well. So I don't know if any of you saw this campaign in South Africa, #RhodesMustFall. So this was about British imperialist Cecil John Rhodes, whose statue was on the campus of the University of Cape Town. A student movement started to have his statue removed. saying that his legacy as a racist and imperialist made it inappropriate for him to be in such a prominent spot on the university. This was a huge movement that garnered a lot of attention, spread to the UK, to the United States in different ways. And then also in South Africa, you can see from this sign, we're not done yet. So hashtag roads must fall in turn became hashtag fees must fall, okay, in South Africa. So students protesting the cost of a tertiary education in South Africa, saying that, you know, schools must be more affordable, universities must be more affordable. That hashtag Asina Mali, that's just Zulu for we don't have money. You know, we don't have money to pay for this. So roads must fall turned into a broader movement about trying to get the government to help with financial aid more. And one thing that's really interesting to me as a historian in all of this is that students are very consciously looking back to earlier eras of protest in South Africa. So you see this like great picture, you know, of the student at a protest as part of the Fees Must Fall movement, holding up this 1976 sign in reference to the Soweto Uprising and the role that students had played in that movement, and saying that students want to do something similar in post-apartheid South Africa. And so I guess I could wrap up by encouraging you to sort of keep watching this unfolding story and think about sort of the new shape that student politics are taking there.